When communism comes knocking at the door, it says, "Hi, I'm here to liberate you from oppression." It promises a paradise on earth. But the actual fruits of communism are impoverishment, enslavement, and death.
And so what they had to do is they had to rework Marxism. They saw that in the West, that there was this moral bulwark around society that was preventing communism from taking hold. So they're like, we need to go into education, the legal system, into the churches, into the media, and to the family, and rot these institutions from within. That process, that was over a century ago. We see the evidence all around us.
It was created by communists for communist purposes. The ultimate objective was to destroy Christianity. Those were his words.
No, not God bless America, God damn America.
If we don't do anything to take back our culture in America, what will be our fate? How much longer do we have?
Hey everyone, welcome back to Be Not Afraid. Today my guest is reoccurring. It's Julie Behling, who's written the book Beneath Sheep's Clothing. We did an interview about a year ago, and I thought I would have her back on. She's about to release her documentary film. In the past, we talked about things from the past, and now we're going to talk about what we're seeing today. So welcome, Julie.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, let's just dive in. I want to talk about the documentary. I think that a lot of people will be very interested, and just what's driven you to make it and where we are today.
Yeah, so the documentary is, hopefully can be put out later by the end of the year, but actually what I'm doing right now is fundraising for it, because it costs money to pay a filmmaker and to bring the people in to do interviews or to go travel to them. Basically, I mean, you had me on, and I sent you a copy of my book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, and then the subtitle of The Communist Takeover of Culture in the USSR and Parallels in Today's America. Basically, just for anyone who's not familiar with the book or with myself, I was a missionary in Russia in the late 90s, and then I came back to the US and I got a dual master's in Russian language and literature and Russian and East European studies. And I wrote my master's thesis on underground Christian movements in the Soviet Union, and their survival tactics and the tactics of the Soviet state to try to decimate Christianity and religion in general. So I did that, and I defended my thesis in 2004. And it was a few years later, 2008, that I began seeing some of the same anti-religious tactics that I researched for my thesis happening in America. And then I looked further, and all the three major tactics that the Soviets used to try to decimate Christianity were all in place in America. And it might seem counterintuitive, because at first the Soviets massacred Christians, but in the latter part of the Soviet Union, they got away from that, and they had a much more sneaky set of tactics. And those are the ones that are in place in America, kind of adapted for Americans. And I was finally able to finish my book last year and publish it last year. And it was a few weeks later that a documentary filmmaker reached out to me, and who's very interested in talking with me about making my book into a documentary. And so there we go. We're going from there.
So in terms of the things that you saw, and you've just said that multiple things are in place right now, I'm reminded of Yuri Bezmenov.
Yes.
And I've just really been thinking about the things that he said would have to be in place for the destruction of our country, basically.
Right.
And the one that seems the most clear today is demoralization. But we also kind of look like we're heading into crisis at the same time.
Yeah. In my book, and I refer, and you've read my book, and I refer to that interview with him. I believe crisis began in March of 2020 with COVID lockdown. I believe that was the beginning of crisis. Not that most of the people involved in that knew what they were doing, but it doesn't take everyone to understand. Yeah, for anyone who's not familiar with that video, you should definitely watch it. It was recorded in 1985. Yuri Bezmenov was a former KGB agent who defected to the West and was trying to warn the West about communism. And he himself was a KGB propagandist. And he says in the video that upwards of 80% of the KGB's resources went towards subverting other nations to communism through very sneaky ways, the demoralization, which takes a generation or more, which he said was way over fulfilled by 1985 in America. America was already sufficiently demoralized by 1985 that they were really way ahead of the game with that. Crisis, step 2, takes 3 to 6 years, 3 to 5 years, where a nation's infrastructure comes under attack, various, whether it's the border, whether it's the healthcare system, the economy, whether there's war. And then there is, that's destabilization. Sorry. And then crisis is the really actually 6 weeks is what crisis is supposed to be. It's like the overthrow of the government. And then the normalization. I think we're in all 4 at once, to be honest with you. I didn't put that in my book, but I think we have all 4 because we have a coup. We've had ongoing coup type activity going on. And we have a normalization of trying to normalize all of these agendas. And yeah, I think it's all 4 at the same time.
I know that there's a lot of people who, the second they hear the word communism, they dismiss and they think, oh, you're paranoid. Oh, that's a conspiracy. What are we seeing today that just simply cannot be argued by rational people that this is an exact example of what communism would look like?
So Marxism, my definition of Marxism is it's a playbook to prepare a nation to accept communism, to fall to communism. And Marxism, as I know you're very well aware, it takes, you're looking at Karl Marx, the German philosopher from the 19th century who wrote the Communist Manifesto. And it's a playbook. What you do is you locate a group of oppressed people. And in classical Marxism, the people are the lower class economically. And you locate those people, you gather them together, and you stoke grievance within them, stoke them to envy and to anger against their oppressor. It's an oppressed versus oppressor dynamic. So this oppressed versus oppressor dynamic is like the heart of Marxism. And once you can get enough of the people of this quote unquote oppressed class to constantly try to tear down and just take out the oppressor, then there's a vacuum of power where the communists can come in and assume power. And there you have it. And this has been done. It sounds like, oh, that sounds like that wouldn't work, but it worked. It's worked all over the world. In fact, by 1985, 1/3 of the world was living in a communist nation, 1/3 of the population of the whole world. And then, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union just a few years after that, and, 1990, 91, but there's still other communist regimes, and communism, the goal for communists is to be a global, one world, global tyranny. I mean, they don't call it a tyranny. It's a utopia in their mind, but it's a utopia where people are executed if they don't go along with it. And it's a utopia where if you're just a little too smart, a little too wealthy, a little too exceptional, you're on the chopping block for execution and gulag and everything else. So it's not the kind of utopia I want anything to do with. What this has to do with Marxism has to do with today, as you're well aware, I know, is it's mutated. There were Marxist intellectuals in Europe that after Russia fell to communism, they were expecting that Europe and the rest of the West and the world would just collapse and fall into communism. And when that didn't happen, they had to reassess the playbook, the Marxist playbook, and they came up with cultural Marxism. So they were like, okay, in order to get the West, and they literally say this explicitly in their writings, in order to get the West to fall, well, I use the word fall, but to become communist, first we need to infiltrate the main cultural producers, which would be education, the media, the family, the churches, and the legal system. And we're going to infiltrate these. And so that was, over 100 years ago, that process began in the West. And then we have the neo-Marxists and the critical theorists that are, again, taking Marxism to the next level, where they're using that oppressed versus oppressor construct. But they go into the different nations and they look for what will specifically work for that culture. And in America, the biggest point of exploitation is, of course, the divide between the races, between Black and white, and the residual wounding of the nation from slavery and from ongoing racial issues and outright oppression of Black people in America. So that has been exploited, and then we have critical race theory, where Black people are de facto the oppressed, white people and whiteness and white supremacy are the oppressor. And you don't just get Black people to tear down the oppressor, you get allies on your side that are going to pick at and tear down the oppressive, quote unquote, system of power, which is anything created by a white person, anything that can be construed as, part of systemic racism, and see that the tricky thing is that there are truths there, that there is the history of oppression. There's truths that Black people in America have been at a disadvantage, historically speaking, and some of them may still be today. And Americans, our compassion has been exploited. Our compassion for the downtrodden has been exploited. And but you can tell it's Marxism because it's oppressed versus oppressor, and it's running off of grievance. And it's a very similar tactic to, again, how Russia felt at communism. And then, of course, we've got the queer Marxism as well that we could go into.
One of the things that I'm always trying to get people to understand is the systemic racism that has happened to the African Americans in its most raw and vile form is the fact that they convinced people that they could not do for themselves, and that instead they must demand justice. They must be so consumed with demanding justice that justice has morphed into something that doesn't even look like justice anymore. It now looks like entitlement. It now looks like a power struggle. People who have not in their lifetime experienced slavery, experienced segregation. I don't have another word for it than it's almost like fantasize about it so much that that's what they want to put on other people. And so when they say, we've been oppressed and we need X, the X is we need power. And from what I've seen in just the last few years of that power, it's not going to be benevolent. It's going to be crushing, soul crushing in the way that they've been convinced in their head has been done to them. The systemic racism part of it is that African Americans have been the guinea pigs.
Yes.
And it's a very hard thing as a person of color, as a person with African American blood, to think that all of these people who've said that they're on our side and want to lift us up have actually been making sure that they've got their thumb on us and that we're kept down. And now that's spreading through queer ideology.
Yes.
Now, what worked on African Americans to keep them down, to keep them angry and bitter and demanding this thing that doesn't lift them up. It just says, look at me, look at me, look at me, but it doesn't actually lift them.
Right.
Is now going through our schools to all of our children.
Yeah. Another way that I was thinking about how to explain Marxism to people in an even more simple way, and I came up with this, and I think Marxism is a parasite that attaches itself to different causes. There are legitimate people who have fought for and worked for civil rights for African Americans. Absolutely. 100% our nation was in need and has been in need of people who legitimately are working for civil rights. But then Marxism comes and begins to parasitize these different causes and then use the people as human shields to push through communism, unbeknownst to the majority of the people that are part of that cause. And so same thing with the queer Marxist agenda, the queer theory, gender theory. I have a friend whose son is gay, and came out in middle school. And so she's very much an ally of the cause, and I can understand why. And her son has been bullied. Um, so she's very sensitive to the needs of children who are on the LGBTQ spectrum. And I can understand that and sympathize with that. But then there's a problem when you're going full tilt into the agenda to try to tear down the heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and that it just doesn't even make sense. Basically, the goal of the queer Marxists at the top, most of the people who are working for LGBTQ children or adults are not conscious of this. They are being used as pawns for this agenda to tear down the normalcy of males being males and females being females, and the normalcy of males and females being attracted to each other. I hate to break it to people, but the continuation of the species literally depends upon males being males and females. As someone who studied biology in college, the whole natural world, with very few exceptions, is built on the binary genders. So it's kind of insane, but then again, it's an exploitation of the compassion. So for the allies, it's exploiting their compassion for whatever their child or their sibling or loved one who is gay, and now they feel like they're going to join and be allies, but they need to understand what this agenda is about. They can still be advocates for LGBTQ and not be part of the queer Marxist agenda. It is possible to do both of those things, I believe.
And how would you suggest that they can do that?
They need to support, like, the group Gays Against Groomers. Keep the kids. You don't bring the drag queens to the children. You don't bring the drag queens into the schools. You don't bring the indoctrinating pornographic books promoting trans and queer stuff to children in public school. And you just live and let live, and let people learn to be respectful of all people.
Yeah, I always think that it's the difference of the individual versus the collective. As an individual, you cherish that individual, you let them know how important they are, you create more, you help them focus on more than just the fact that they are X, whether
Right.
it is Black, gay, queer, whatever it is.
Yes,
That's one tiny part of who a human being is,
absolutely.
versus pushing them into a collective, which
Yes.
often silences their own voice. I've got young friends who are members of GSA, and they're going, why do they need all this information about me? And why am I only this? And the reason that they feel like they can talk to me is because, as a person of color, they see the tokenization that I go through. And it is the same. It is the exact same thing. They're being used and they're being reduced into something that isn't healthy. And we know it isn't healthy because, scientifically speaking, people who are bitter, people who are resentful,
Yes.
tend to be less healthy, tend to live shorter lives. And today it seems like we are creating a culture of fragility.
Back to critical race theory. The whole thing that California is doing, and that these different politicians are bringing up reparations for like millions of dollars,
Right.
which is insane for so many reasons. It makes me wonder if they're doing that to appeal to the lowest denominator within of Black people who are really want money, and then they're gonna like get it anyway, like the criminal element.
Yes.
And they're going to demand their money somehow or another. And I think they want to radicalize that small portion of any group. There's always a criminal element. I think they want to radicalize even further those people that will feel entitled to, they will feel entitled to millions of dollars, and boy, they will use violence to get it. And I think they'll be encouraged to be honest.
I wouldn't
what
disagree with that, but I also think that makes them disposable, because
Yes.
very few places are minorities. That's why we're called minorities. The majority of people. So if you take Utah, for example, we have less than 3% people are African American.
Yeah.
If you start demanding, making demands that impose on other people, because it really seems like the only way people get activated is if their own comfort zone is stepped on. Just like take COVID, for instance, right? During the pandemic, parents were very active. They got very involved and wanted to see changes in the schools. But as soon as the masks were removed, they couldn't care less about a lot of the other things. Not all of them, but a large group could care less about the real insidious kind of harm that's coming to our children.
Right.
Because their comfort was restored. So when we create a race war, the minorities are not going to win it. So
they're cannon fodder. And same thing with the allies. I mean, the Antifa, the white Antifa people. I mean, have you ever seen any black Antifa? I can't recall seeing. They're almost all white, and they're very violent. They are the cannon fodder for the Marxist revolution here, and it's very sad.
Well, and also there's kind of a delusion about it because they believe that they're powerful. The press makes them feel like they're powerful.
Yes.
But in case of a real war, these are people who generally they fight in their heads. They say the biggest threat to America is the white conservative. Most white conservatives are kind of slow boiling, I think. I think that
Yes.
there is this underlying, is somebody going to do something kind of feeling going on? I'm worried about when that boils over, because I do think that a lot of what's happening today in America is feeding resentment so much that when it boils over, it's like they've predicted what's going to happen.
Yeah, we can't fall into the trap. We, meaning anyone who likes freedom, we have to stay out of hate and out of violence, and actually love our quote unquote enemies.
Right.
That's really
well, and I think we need to remember they're not our enemies.
exactly.
Like the biggest thing that I think of is they know not what they do.
Yes.
That's why we have to have these conversations, even when it does get to the point of being exhausted and demoralized and feeling like you're the only one talking or the only one doing something, because they have been indoctrinated.
Yes.
Especially, and let's go there, especially within the schools, young teachers.
Yes.
It's like they don't even know
No.
what it is that they're doing, but they feel so powerful in pushing that agenda.
It looks just like Soviet history to me. It looks exactly like the revolutionaries and the Marxists and the communists in the Soviet Union. They emboldened the youth. They had the Young Pioneers was the program that all the children were to belong to, that they were radicalized and radicalizing the children from the youngest of ages. And yeah, the children felt very emboldened and very sure of themselves, very righteous. It's a very righteous thing. And again, because they're tapping into the part of the brain, at least it appears to, and many people have commented on this, it taps into the religion and like the need for humans to have an ideology of some sort. And it's more rigid and black and white than the most fundamentalist of Christian churches, more than you could even imagine that Marxism and communism are.
So how is it coming into our churches? How come it's not very clear for those people of faith that you cannot be both Marxist and Christian?
Well, because the infiltration of America's churches with communists, literal communists, began over a century ago. There was very big money behind this. They infiltrated the seminaries for the clergy for the churches that belonged to the National Council of Churches. This is all documented. There were people speaking out and trying to blow the whistle on this, way back 1940s, 1950s, and even earlier, because there were some of them were avowed communists. They subverted roughly half of America's Christian churches, mainline Christian churches, by the mid-20th century. And the little switcheroo game where in Christian theology, we are to love our neighbor. That's definitely one thing that Jesus taught. But really the kernel of Christianity, as far as I understand it, and maybe we discussed this before, it's coming to know God and letting Jesus heal and, atone for our sins, to become one with God, and we can return to be with God as we become one with him and follow his way. And that's what every Christian church I've ever interacted with, that's what they believe. But what was done in so many of our churches in America was that they replaced that kernel of Christianity with a social gospel, which was social justice. And you can see how that could be very easy to do, because so many Christians do feel such a strong drive to go out into the world and serve those who are underprivileged. And that's good. That's very good. But there was that switcheroo, and then we had some of these clergy coming out and casting doubt on the divinity of Jesus and casting doubt on the Bible, and really the atonement of Jesus going by the wayside in some cases. And so, and again, half of America's mainline churches by the mid 20th century, the infiltration has continued. In the last decade or so, evangelical churches in America have been under severe attack from the top with literal Marxists. And you're better off. Any major church in America is either infiltrated to some degree or another, many of them very fully infiltrated, or they've been major targets. You just have to look at the fruit. And it's very sad to say that the most heavily subverted churches, in my opinion, and after my research, are unfortunately the Black Christian churches were heavily radicalized with liberation theology, Black liberation theology, which is explicitly Marxist. Explicitly, it's a KGB operation. And this was brought into the African American churches in the 60s to bring in essentially critical race theory, intermingling that with Christianity and radicalizing the populace.
And they're so convinced. They're so convinced that they will, in my experience, really embrace the victimhood narrative, because they're so convinced of their own righteousness that everybody else is the problem. And in Christianity, Christ is the Redeemer. Right. So for me, as a Christian, I've never had a moment where I've bought into that, because as somebody, as someone who is a Christian, I believe that when I became a Christian, my sins were cast as far away from the east as from the west, and I've become a new creation. So anything that I was before is a clean slate. That's what grace and mercy are.
Very unifying message. The Christian message is very unifying for all of humanity. Every last part of humanity. And
we're following where a lot of churches and a lot of church schools are embracing Ibram X. Kendi, who says that if you believe in the redemption story, you are a white supremacist.
That's pure evil to teach that. There are some churches now in America that support, the sex change surgery for children, and support, they have drag queen bingo and various things in the churches.
Right.
And I guess they feel really, really liberal and really, really righteous about doing that. I don't know.
All of history kind of repeats itself. Some people say history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Well, what we're doing to children today in the name of owning our own virtuousness is sacrificing them. Yes. We're not only sacrificing the kids today, the actual student today, but we're sacrificing their ability to have children in the future.
Yeah.
And they're really too young in most cases to make that decision. So a lot of them, and this is where the good fruit comes in, right? Because a lot of them will say, we're just affirming them, we're just loving them. But is it love to kind of push them so that you can feel virtuous, so that you can be a teacher and put, I'm your safe place on the desk? Is it love when they resent it? When they come to terms and they go, what did I do? And they're looking at, and they're saying, no adult stood up and helped me.
Yeah. I watched this video yesterday with a woman who's a whistleblower who herself worked in a gender clinic here in America. She is a gay woman who is married to a trans man.
Yes.
She's not anti-gay. She is not anti-trans. Did you watch that video?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And basically, and it was with trigonometry.
Yes.
The image that they came up with is it's a conveyor belt. The way this system is working in America in these gender clinics and with the psychologists and the whole system is that once a child speaks up, I'm trans, which by the way, they're taught how to do that in the schools now and reinforced in social media, then they go onto this conveyor belt and it takes them to the hormone blockers, to the cross-sex hormones, and to the genital mutilation and sterilization. And that it's just so many kids being pumped through this that, a lot of them are on the autism spectrum. These kids were bullied. Some of them have other mental issues. And these are kids.
And to tie it into the whole conversation, it's that queer is the new ideology.
Yes.
So it's not simply this child is attracted to this
Right.
or identifies as this. It's
Right.
now that you're a member of the queer community, you must behave in a certain way. And one of the most alarming things I've seen is someone sent me something from Queer Youth Assembly, and it was an actual call to action of what students, junior high and high school students, should do. So they should walk out of school, they should wear their queer gear, and they should leave the school in protest. And their list was extremely political. And these are junior high kids who can't even vote, but they were supposed to stand outside and make demands. How are we not seeing that is using these kids? And that they, as opposed to the Red Guard, today's kids could be called the Rainbow Guard.
Yeah.
And while they're not yet violent, actually, I mean,
Some of them are.
we still don't have certain manifestos, right?
Well, and I saw you share this, and I looked further into it about that shirt that Target is picking up about Satan uses pronouns, and I looked at that person's full line of pins and gear that they have on their website, and several of the pins are calls for violence, and there's a lot of death imagery, like skulls and crossbones and weapons, and like going after the heteronormative and the cisnormative people, and it's time for them to go. There was a guillotine.
Oh my gosh.
And it said pillow for the heteronormative or something, and then there was a lighter, and it said let's blow up the cis Tim.
Which, if you don't understand what cis means, that's comfortable in skin. They also go after people who are lesbian or gay and not interested in the movement. There are people who will say, if you aren't wearing your mask, and they're not talking pandemic mask, they're talking about Black Antifa mask. If you aren't wearing your mask and protesting, then you're not genuinely part of the queer community. The other day, I was getting coffee, and this young woman, just delightful, the sweetest girl that you could ever imagine. But she felt the need while talking to me and just in giving me my coffee to tell me that she was part of the queer community or whatever. We have so many people that are joining the queer community simply because they don't want to be considered cis.
They don't want to be part of the oppressor class.
Yes.
Which is heteronormative and cis.
And statistically, many of these people that are in this group, in the queer community, are still dating the opposite gender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They just are joining this group because it's a way out.
Oh yeah.
They
Yeah.
have no idea the ideology that's behind it. They have no idea the violence behind it because they're taught love wins.
Right.
But it's not love if in that you're being taught to hate someone. And right. I know that there are people who, both you and I, get called haters all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, but I don't hate someone. I mean,
No.
if I see somebody who's suffering in the road, I'm not going to go and say, oh, are you on my side?
Right.
And they are being taught that. They are being taught, let them rot if they're not on your side. And that's where Marxism takes you. They feel powerful for this short amount of time. And then once they're no longer useful, what happens? So, Julie, what do people think a Marxist utopia is going to look like?
Universal basic income, reparations, everyone's rolling in it. No one has to work because the government's picking up the tab. A sexual free-for-all maybe thrown into the mix. They tried that out in the Soviet Union and got rid of that part of it because it was disastrous. Its result, they tried to do away with the family and have free-for-alls. And anyways, lots of orphans resulted from that. But they don't have to pay student loans, free college. I guess that's probably what they're thinking. But the thing is, if they have an understanding of history, you see how this plays out in other countries, that can be a good wake-up call. That's really one of the main parts of why I feel very compelled to turn my book into a documentary, is to illustrate, not just on a black and white page, but in picture, in video format, what does communism do to people? How does that utopia turn out? here are the stacks of 100 million bodies from the 20th century alone from communism, and it's still ongoing. The death toll. The fruits of communism, as I say, are impoverishment, enslavement, and death. And it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. It comes peddling something. It's going to be the answer to all your problems, but that is not what it brings. And I'm truly hoping to be able to reach some young people with my documentary, showing how kids were radicalized in the Soviet Union, how they were brainwashed, and showing the parallels today. That is one part of the documentary, and we will actually have, actors and sets to shoot those parts of the documentary. So it will be right there for people to watch.
Can you give some quick examples on how they got these kids?
Well, first of all, they had to get the kids away from Christianity, and and that is definitely a huge part of my documentary, as well as showing how they infiltrated the churches, how they used anti-Christian propaganda, pro-Soviet propaganda. One example is from my major professor when I was in grad school, who herself was a Soviet dissident who was able to get to the United States in the 70s. She was so desperate to leave the Soviet Union that she sent them a letter she sent her own Soviet government a letter in the 70s saying that if they did not grant her an exit visa, she would set herself on fire in an act of protest. And she received her exit visa the day before she was planning on going out in flames in protest. That's how much she was really ready to be out of the Soviet Union. She gave an example of teachers, elementary school age teachers in the Soviet Union, saying, okay, boys and girls, go ahead and close your eyes, and I want you to go ahead and ask God to give you some candy. Go ahead, do it right now. So the kids they say a little prayer asking God to give them candy. The teacher says, okay, open your eyes now. Did you get any candy? Oh, you didn't? Oh, all right, children, close your eyes. Ask Uncle Lenin to give you a piece of candy. Go ahead and do it now, boys and girls. And while the kids are having their eyes closed and praying to Lenin to give them candy, the teacher puts a piece of candy on every desk. Okay, open your eyes. Look, children, look, boys and girls, Uncle Lenin gave you candy. Now we know who we can really trust and have our hope and our faith in. That's one example of brainwashing to get them away from 1,000 years of Christianity in Russia and the Eastern Slavic lands. They converted to Christianity in the year 970. That was one tactic. Then you would have the kids involved in different drills and repeating the slogans over and over again. They would wear a little Lenin pin on their lapel and their little red Young Pioneer neckerchief. Every book, every movie, every piece of art in the country had to praise the Soviet system. What do we see today in America? But just about every movie and show is promoting the queer Marxist or critical race theory agendas ad nauseum. So all the media that the kids are consuming, there's no opportunity for them to consume anything else, is just the pro-Marxist, pro-communist. You have it. So the parents are terrified that if they teach their children any differently, they could be killed. We're not to that point in America. I certainly hope we never get to that point. But in order to not get to that point, we've really got to wake up as many people as possible and to what these agendas are and put our foot down about it. Those are just a few examples anyways.
So you said that we're not to that point. I'm starting to feel like we are very, very close.
I think we are close.
Look at the federal recommendations for sex standards for our kids. And if you look at some of those exercises are very similar. There are adults who will say government is the new God. How close to communism are we in America today?
Well, going back to Yuri Bezmenov's 4-step, pathway to communism, the crisis phase lasts for 6 weeks. So the long phase is the demoralization. That was already done by 1985.
Yeah.
We're in the very, very end stages of, there could be a crisis. Probably the biggest hindrance is that Americans are armed, but there's other ways for them to enact a crisis to overthrow things. And again, we kind of already are in crisis to a degree, very close. It could be the next big thing in a week if enough people don't understand what this agenda is and don't step up and stand up.
So, Julie, what hope do we have right now? Are you seeing an improvement since the last time we talked? Are you seeing?
Well, there's an improvement in that there's probably more people aware, because now the agenda is so in your face and absurd. And this is the thing about the Soviet Union. The amount of absurdities one encounters when studying Soviet history is just nonstop absurdity. And now we're at that stage here in America where the absurdities, every day there's a new absurdity. Like, how can this possibly be happening? So we do have more people waking up. We need to accelerate that. Are we going to save our country from a collapse? I don't think that's going to happen at this point, but we can save individuals. I think we can save individuals. I think that the main things, there's two main things that we need to do. Number one, we need to understand these agendas, and we need to help other people understand them, like now. Like, there's not time to waste. And then the next thing is, I think we need to, whether we're Christian or whatever we are, we need to connect with the divine. We need to connect with God. And we need to have that love in our hearts for all of humanity, no matter how things go, where we are maintaining love for all and showing love for all. And again, not that having love for all means that we let agendas just walk all over our kids and take our kids. Absolutely not. We will stand up for truth and have love in our hearts at the same time. That is what we've got to do. It's pretty simple.
Well, and that's one of the most beautiful things in your book. Just the people who were able to overcome. They went through horrendous things, and in the end, they still had their soul.
Yes.
Because they didn't compromise. And
yes.
The things that they went through, no, none of us want to go through that. But no. Imagine just handing your kids over, because that's what we're doing. If we don't stand, we are handing our kids over to that kind of a life.
Yeah.
There isn't this perfect utopia. Communism never comes without bloodshed. And just that amount of control. That's really the reason that I fight, is because it is a battle for our souls, but also our children's souls.
Yes.
It is not fair to not allow them to be able to find out who they are and what they believe for themselves, but to impose that on them starting in kindergarten. Starting with things like, oh, let's do the puppy experiment. Oh, the puppies aren't being adopted, so let's walk around and tell people, you need to adopt the puppies, and make cute little posters and celebrate the fact that they're doing a protest. And then the next day it's climate change, and then the next day it's Black Lives Matter, and we're just turning these kids into pawns.
Yeah.
When we can stop it by just saying, not mine. You don't get to do that with mine. And I think the other trick to that is to find an alternative that is so attractive that other people look and say, how did you do that? I want that too. I think it's that simple on how we can undo this. So you have James Lindsay coming out in the next month.
Yeah, we're still nailing down the date, but okay. James Lindsay has agreed to be interviewed for my documentary, and we're going to bring him to St. George, Utah, and I am so excited. He is truly one of the groundbreaking figures in exposing all things woke Marxism, coming at it from an academic perspective. And we're going to be having a live event down here in St. George, also going to be live streaming it. And I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. I'm going to go through the ways in which the communists and the Soviet Union, how they took over culture, and what that looked like there in the Soviet Union. And then for about an hour, James Lindsay will speak on America's Marxist cultural revolution. We will, this is also going to be a fundraiser for my documentary, and we're selling tickets for $15. And the $15 will go to, I'm hoping we can fund my whole documentary. I'm asking a lot. It will take a lot of people sharing and being willing to donate, even $15. And people can go to my Give, Send, Go. That's how you buy a ticket. If you donate to Beneath Sheep's Clothing, the documentary, donate $15 or more by the time we have the event, which again, it'll be sometime in June, probably the latter part of June. You will automatically either be able to come in person here in St. George or view the live stream. But it's givesendgo.com/Beneath Sheep's Clothing. There's one more thing I wanted to mention about my documentary. I had to go down about 1,000 rabbit holes writing my book, and it was a lot of research for many, many years. And one of the things that I go into in my book and will go into in the documentary is another one of the Soviet tactics to try to dismantle Christianity. And that was instead of like early in the beginning of the Soviet Union, they went after all the Christians. They were executing Christian clergy. It was just a bloodbath, but it backfired. It bred a lot of underground religious Christian activity. And so what they started doing after World War II is they only saved their heavy-handed approach of oppression for the fringes, the people that were considered part of cults. And in the case of the Soviet Union, those cultists were Baptists, Pentecostals, and Seventh-day Adventists who were operating outside of any government oversight. They were underground, and they were the cultists that got that heavy hand. They had their children taken from them. They were imprisoned. They were maligned nonstop in the media and in the culture. And we have some groups here in America that have been the brunt of extremely heavy-handed government, I would say oppression. They are highly unpopular. People in the Christian world do not want to associate with these groups, and I understand why. But one of the things that I'm hoping that we need to get over the cult label, and that we insist on due process for all people, because there might be some churches that are legitimately, there's some problems there, whether if it's child brides or whatever the case may be, and that's fine. That needs to be addressed, but we must insist on due process of law, and not like having governments go in with tanks without proper warrants and seizing children, and in the case of the Branch Davidians, torching their compound, killing men, women, and children. We really have to insist on due process, even in the face of a massive propaganda campaign against any particular group that might have some legitimate problems. That's another thing and if people can see how the Soviet fringe groups who are Baptists, who we can relate to much more here in America, because they're just like a lot of us conservative Christians in America, and see how they were treated, we can come to the point where we will support due process for all, even here in America, even the groups that we think are evil.
Well, I'm reminded of that poem or that writing that said, they came for the Jews and I said nothing, and they came for this group and I said nothing, they came for this group and nothing, and when they came for me, there was no one to stand up for me. And we're there.
Exactly.
We're already there. We're already at a place where our government says that we as Christians are the biggest threat to America. They say white supremacy, but they log, like I said, Ibram X. Kendi said that if you believe that Jesus Christ and the redemption, then you are a white supremacist. And then the government says white supremacy is the biggest threat.
And you're a conservative, so you would be considered the black face of white supremacy, which is very absurd, the most absurd thing.
Absolutely considered that. So, and that's fine. But I do think that you're right. We have to stand up. We have to demand. I just don't know how we do when we live in what we live in right now. It's one of those things where this, I think, what we can wrap on this, but the demoralization is real.
Yeah.
Every day there's a reason to just give up and say, I don't think I can do this anymore. But we can't do that. The second that we do that, they win. And I don't believe in the end that they do win.
No.
So
no, and I see that you're working tirelessly and you're putting yourself out there, and I'm certainly really grateful for all the work that you do, and all of your listeners should be immensely grateful. And you know what? Not everyone can have a podcast necessarily, not everyone, but we all have different roles, and there's all different things that we can do. We can all do something. Right. And we need to do something.
We can. And when everybody does their small part, that gives hope, encouragement. James Lindsay just recently did a piece, and he talked about the different groups, right? Yeah. There was one group under normies, and he said they help the rebels. They help those of us on the front lines, because when we feel encouraged by them, we can keep going, and it makes it honestly more safe for us. I hate falling into the whole safety culture thing, but sometimes we're in places of real danger. We're in places where we really are getting threats. I'm not in that place. The culture that I'm in is more of a shunning culture, pretending I don't exist. I'd prefer to be that than to be afraid. But I think that when we speak together, when we share these stories and have these voices, and my friends, please go get her book, and please consider donating, because this is such important work, and her book is so well written. It's jam-packed not only with information about the past, but also with really practical steps in what you can do for your school board, what you can do in your churches, what you can do in your communities to wake people up in a gentle way. Because Julie is a very loving person. She's very, just very warm, and I'd say more gracious than I am in terms of her level of tolerance. And I think that's something that we can all learn from. Julie, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to share it widely, and I hope that everyone who hears does the same.
Thank you so much.